What is the goal of a rework? To change or to improve? Is it to build upon something or to alter it on a fundamental level? It's a question whose answer differs from one champion to another, but no matter the execution, they all lead to the same ultimate goal: to make the champion better, ambiguous as that may sound. Reworks over the years have been on average highly successful, transforming irredeemable piles of garbage into some of the most well-designed cast members in the game. Yet despite their net positive track record, several projects haven't bore quite as much fruit as they would have liked, either prompting a revisitation on their design or even a reversion back to their original state. Throughout my Rework Retrospective series, I highlighted VGUs that turned zeros into heroes, and VGUs that left me wondering if they could have done things a bit differently. But none of their prior episodes come even remotely close to the absolute gargantuan dumpster fire that is the Rune Mage's tumultuous past. Long overdue, but better late than never. Today I bring you Ryze's Rework, a retrospective. Ryze has become immortalized in history as the guy who keeps getting reworked, yet still fails to acquire healthy footing in the meta for being too strong, too weak, too hard, too easy, what have you. He's gone through so many iterations from the game's release to around 2019, when the design team effectively gave up on the champion conceptually, instead choosing to just deal with him as is. In hindsight, Ryze's current version isn't really all that bad, but I think what has made him perennially obscure nowadays, in spite of being so present during the first decade of the game, was because his reputation precedes him, and not in a complimentary way. Most people, even those who joined the game recently, see Ryze as the guy who Riot can never get right no matter how many second chances they give him. He was the game's archetypal mage character, someone whose DPS consisted of repeated blasts of magic damage as opposed to physical attacks, and while all variants of his kit were superficially understandable, other mages are much more popular than him, and much more pragmatic. So what exactly went wrong with him that prompted half a dozen changes over the years? Only one way to find out: by looking through everything. For the sake of brevity, I'm only going to cover the final iteration of his first and second major versions, as those have actual wiki descriptions and whatnot. I won't be covering his alpha kit, nor will I be going through the little mini changes they did in between, except for his concurrent version. Starting with this first iteration, there's not that big of a difference between Ryze 1 and Ryze 2 on paper. It's mostly just a passive and a few small tweaks to his abilities. It's still worth mentioning though. This was during a time when League was much less multi-dimensional, with the elementary point-and-click abilities being nothing short of prolific, causing a measurable number of champions to be very stat-checky in nature, and Ryze was no exception. Back when his entire moveset consisted of them, you basically walked up to a champion and mashed their face on the keyboard in the hopes that you could kill your opponent before they killed you first. This would be the only time where his main damaging spell Overload was a point-and-click, granting him passive cooldown reduction and having a ton of mana scaling into it. Rune Prison was a point-and-click damaging ability as well that also rooted the target for up to 1.4 seconds, and with a cast range of 600, this was one of the most effective single-target lockdowns in the game. Then you had Spellflux, another point-and-click blast of damage that reduced the target's MR for a few seconds. It would subsequently splash onto nearby enemies, not unlike the way Brand's ultimate does, with the potential to then bounce back to the initial target. His combos are fairly simple: toss E to reduce MR, then root the enemy, and throw out Q. There wasn't much nuance to his gameplay outside of that. Arcane Mastery is where you'll see most of the changes he went through over the years, but this was arguably the simplest iteration he had. Upon usage of any ability, the cooldowns of his other abilities would refresh by 1.5 seconds. It's thanks to his passive that we have some semblance of skill expression, where you want to space out your Q, W, and E's ever so slightly in order to maximize that passive cooldown refund, especially in the early game. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that version 1 Ryze was simple to a fault, with 3 point-and-click abilities, a passive that let you spam those point-and-clicks faster, and his ultimate, which I'll go in more detail later because it's the same in version 2. His effectiveness hinged on numbers and numbers alone. If he had good numbers, he would melt everyone. If he had bad numbers, he would get overshadowed. Granted, he was effective at what he did, but the problem with stat checkers is that there's no such thing as a balance for them. Stat checkers are either too strong or too weak, never in between, especially when all their attacks are point-and-click. You literally couldn't dodge them if you tried. It's here where we encounter the main design challenge with Ryze that would affect him all the way until even now actually. He was conceptualized as a magic damage AD carry, someone with a continuous stream of damage rivaling that of marksman, but in the form of abilities. While the rate of fire of basic attacks is dependent on attack speed, the rate of fire for abilities is cooldowns, hence why he has that passive CDR on his Q and the refund mechanic on his passive. Towards the late game, his Q, W, and E can be spammed faster and faster, since by then he would have 40% CDR, making the flat reduction on his passive that much more significant. The problem is, what keeps auto attacks balanced is their single target nature. Even with items like Rune Hurricane, auto attacks rarely have the ability to strike more than one enemy per round. Ryze, however, was a mage who did have that property. Desperate Power would cause all his attacks to deal half damage to nearby enemies around their primary target, almost as if he gave him the Ravenous Hydra effect back when it could work off abilities during the Mythic Items era. This obviously posed an issue for balance, since if the enemy team was close enough together, he could melt entire squads on his own, whereas most marksmen would have to focus on one target at a time, giving him a significantly higher DPS ceiling than is healthy for one champion with this kind of attack style to have. It's the main reason why Cassiopeia, despite having 2 large AoE attacks, can only ever focus the bulk of her pressure on one target. It keeps her fair, quote-unquote. This challenge became even more pronounced with each passing version. Version 2 Ryze was functionally identical to version 1 Ryze with a few caveats. Rune Prison's Spellflux and Desperate Power were mostly unchanged, only gaining a few attribute adjustments, such as Spellflux gaining percent and Mars Shred that could stack instead of a flat one-time application, and Desperate Power acquiring the CDR passive that used to be on Overload. Speaking of Overload, it was changed from a point-and-click to a skill shot, which makes it actually avoidable. Of course, the premise is still the same if he applies Rune Prison onto you, but now he can't just walk up and machine gun everything. Arcane Mastery has the same general principle of reducing cooldowns, but they tried to add a bit more finesse to it by making it a power surge instead of a constant presence. After casting 5 abilities, for the next 5 abilities, or the next few seconds, he gained a shield and all his abilities would reduce their cooldowns by Overload's current cooldowns. So version 2 Ryze without his passive would be weaker than his version 1, but much more powerful with his passive on deck, giving him ridiculous amounts of burst damage and even the ability to refresh Rune Prison to use it again shortly after the first cast. There's an abundance of clips of version 2 Ryze throwing out like 3 Rune Prisons in the span of 5 seconds. It was a ton of fun when you could pull it off. While this version of Ryze demanded more thoughtful execution to be played well, he still had the rapid spam playstyle he was always known for. Like I said before though, the aforementioned challenge of trying to balance a mage who can spam their abilities non-stop only became more and more onerous with the passage of time. Version 2 Ryze was even more egregious in this department. Towards the mid to late game, he would essentially have this passive up indefinitely since those 5 cooldown refunding ability casts would count towards the next 5, so if you staggered your ability casts enough, you could keep refreshing the buff over and over and over again. At the same time, with this dual scaling off ability power and mana, he could make extremely efficient use of bruiser and even tank items, since anything that offered mana would still give him damage like Frozen Heart. And again, we have to account for the likelihood of him blowing up entire teams in the mid to late game. There's a reason Ryze was so popular during seasons 4 and 5. If you got going, you had a super tanky mage who could spam AoE damage on everyone while also having insane dueling potential with his chain roots. The 36% MR reduction from Spellflux also made fighting him difficult since a Void Staff plus that gave him enough firepower to shred through even tanks. If you let him scale to late game, you were invariably screwed. It was clear that they had to find some way of tuning down the whole face rolling thing to not be nearly as oppressive, but that's Ryze's entire identity. You take that away, he's not Ryze anymore. At the same time, League was moving in a direction where such a playstyle was no longer welcome. The Visual Gameplay Initiative sought to reimagine champions to be more than just point-and-click one-dimensional bots. It was a question with no answer, a problem with no solution. The Duracell tried to get damn near close to one with this VGU in 2016. Trying to change as much as they could with him while still retaining the feel of his old gameplay, version 3 and later 3.5 was their final, although unfortunately failed attempt at modernizing him. Now, instead of all of his abilities refreshing their cooldown, only his Q would do so. Anytime Ryze casted W or E, he could recast his Q, and if he held off on casting Q until after using 2 abilities, he would gain a surge of movement speed and a shield along with it. Spellflux was changed to instead be a mark type ability, not unlike Ezreal's Essence Flux or LeBlanc's Sigil of Malice. When applying Flux to enemies, the next application would trigger a bonus effect. Overload would deal bonus damage, Rune Prison's root duration would double to 2 seconds, or if he applied Spellflux again onto the same target, it would spread to nearby enemies, allowing for Overload to chain react on all enemies affected by it. So instead of outright giving Ryze AoE damage, they tied it to a condition, just like how they did with this old cooldown refund mechanic between versions 1 and 2. To compensate for the lower accessibility, they naturally increased the reward for doing so, and in his case, Ryze gained much higher highs to reflect the lower lows. Now instead of dealing half damage to nearby enemies in a short radius, Overload did full damage to nearby enemies. Rune Prison had a 2-second root. A single 2-second root may not seem as impactful as multiple 1-second roots, but towards the late game, having one long-lasting CC is more consequential than a bunch of small ones. The unique interactions with Flux allow for a plethora of different combo strings, and when paired with this new game-warping ultimate, no pun intended, it drastically elevated both the skill floor and ceiling of Ryze. This did accomplish one of the goals of making Ryze less of a face roll champion and more of a tactical mage, but the obligatory payout they had to implement in his new toolkit gave way to one of the widest variances of any champion in the history of League. Most champions fluctuate between a 40 to 60% win rate based on a good or bad player. Ryze, however, was more like a 30 to 70 or even 25 to 35. He was such a force of nature in pro play, but was consistently bottom 5 win rate in solo queue, even in the Apex tiers. In a sense, they made him too difficult to play to the point where it no longer became practical unless unless they overtuned him. So basically version 3 Ryze, different as his gear was from the previous iterations, was still suffering from the same problem of being either too strong or too weak, never in between. From 2017 to 2019, they basically gutted the poor guy in all respects. Q losing shield value and speed boost in 7.1, then damage in 7.4, then his E cooldown gaining a full second, and Rune Prison's base duration being cut to 0.75 seconds in 7.5, Realm Warp gaining a full minute of cooldown, and Spellflux dealing only half damage to nearby enemies in 8.5, and Rune Prison losing empowered root duration from 2 seconds to 1.5 in 8.18. They had no choice but to make all these nerfs because of how dominant he was in pro play, and honestly even in solo queue. Sure, he had a consistent negative win rate, but he was still frequently reaching double-digit pick rate in Diamond Plus. Everyone knew how game-breaking he could be when played correctly, so these changes were necessary to bring him down. Eventually though, that made it so the skill and effort required to master him no longer produced a profitable return on investment. It was at this point that Riot realized they went too far in his skill floor and ceiling, evidenced by what they did towards the midpoint of Season 9 being his final gameplay update that we know so far. While his kit stayed the same, the mechanics were changed around a bit. For starters, the bonus damage on Spellflux for Overload was moved to his ultimate instead, intending to nerf his early to mid game. In addition, Spellflux no longer damaged enemies on the spread, only the primary target. These nerfs were to account for Spellflux now spreading onto nearby enemies no matter what, letting you practically spam EQ as a basic combo over and over again. Speaking of Q, Overload no longer gave a shield, worsening his durability, which he relied on especially in the early game. Finally, at base, Rune Prison has no root anymore, instead it only roots through Spellflux. Essentially, they took away a lot of the complexity of version 3 Ryze and brought him to a more simplified state. Still more intricate than version 2 Ryze, but nowhere near as tactically demanding as version 3. This change was initially very unpopular among Ryze players, considering his core identity was always about being stupidly overpowered in certain conditions. That was kind of the whole motif with the champion, he was never meant to be bounced. Ironically though, following version 3.5 Ryze, his win rate has actually stabilized a fair amount. No longer being perma sub 45% win rate, he's now comfortably chilling around 49 for the past couple years give or take. Of course, much of that has to do with how few people are playing him compared to before. I think the reason for that is in exchange for adding more stability to his gameplay, they took away what little reason we had to play him anymore. Presently, Ryze doesn't have anything unique to him. You might as well play any other mage who has either more range, more burst, or whatever. He was the machine gun mage, the guy who could blow up anyone after acquiring items and levels. But with the direction League has been going in recent times, Ryze's identity is no longer compatible. Try as they might have with this version 3, all it did was make things more difficult to balance. What I find interesting about the whole ordeal is that Ryze effectively ended up in the same place he started. He initially began as a champion who could mash the same combo over and over with a patch history consisting mostly of small numbers adjustments to attempt to get him as close to fair as possible. And that's exactly what he is now, a champion who mashes the same basic combo of EQ or EWQ over and over with a patch history consisting mostly of small numbers adjustments to attempt to get him as close to fair as possible. The abilities in gameplay have changed, but the end result is still the same. I have a feeling that Riot just came to terms with how he is right now, which in fairness isn't the worst champion relative to some others, but call it nostalgia, I miss the old Ryze. There was a certain charm to his old gameplay that I don't really find in his new one. Like I said, new Ryze comes off as forgettable. He doesn't do anything to distinguish himself from other mages anymore apart from his ultimate, but Realm Warp is just not a very practical ability on a DPS-oriented champion. They tried to make him do too much, ironically preventing him from doing anything. What do you guys think about Ryze? Do you believe they should give him another try? Incidentally, a couple years ago I made a video on how I would rework him if you want to check it out. That's gonna be it for today, so if you enjoyed the video, it would be great if you could leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at VarsFam, join my Discord server, and check out my other Rework retrospectives if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.